Welcome to Silicon Valley Asian Business Talk.
So my name is Melvin, and I run a startup that focuses on helping founders to operate their companies. So essentially, we serve as an operations manager to take care of all the compliance, their financial operations like accounting and bookkeeping, as well as the people operations like payroll, recruiting. The goal is to essentially simplify the process of running a company for the founder so that they can save time, keep their focus on the really strategic aspect, and leave all the operational work to our platform. So we built a business in Singapore, and we're now in the US. So the company in Singapore is called Starboard, but the product we're going to launch in the US, or we're in the process of launching with some early customers already, is called Stellar.
Discussion topic: the impact of Asian culture on startup founders.
Looking at your culture heritage, your culture background, or your history, basically, do you feel this kind of a culture heritage background give you benefits or advantage or some disadvantages in starting your business, growing your business, doing your new venture activity?
I grew up in Singapore, right? And I grew up in a upper lower to middle class family. That was the context of my growing up, and I went through the Singapore school system, and we were essentially brought up to do things right. We were brought up with a culture of prudence. In Singapore, you don't waste food, for example. Like if your food on the table, like for me and my friends, most of our parents would say, eat everything on the table, like don't waste food, right? So I would say that, growing up, my cultural context had elements of scarcity. The positive way to see it is we were prudent. The negative way to see it is we didn't really have the abundance mentality that I find seems to be more prevalent here in California, right? And so in application, I find that I bootstrap really well. I can get a lot done with very little resources in a very short span of time, right? And that's, I believe, a strength that I can bring to any like running a business or starting a company. The flip side is, because of that kind of upbringing, I generally, if I'm not self-aware enough, I tend not to invest too much into the future, right? I have a preference for prudence and bootstrapping, and I tend to go for like lower cost solutions. And sometimes that will trip me up. Sometimes I need to bring in a really expensive expert, or I need to purchase something that's really expensive, or pay for something, with a high price tag, but it can be very, very useful, right? So I think the key is self-awareness. Right, so that's one aspect of my growing up, right? I would say, and this is, I think this is commonly said, right? A lot of people in Asia say Americans are great at marketing, and actually that's one distinct difference in the culture. I think it's very observable. In a typical room full of people, it's quite typical that people from a Western culture will be a lot more vocal. And that's why people say that they're really great at marketing, because they're willing to speak up and to express their views and to articulate their thoughts. Whereas I find that most, obviously not all, but many Asians would generally prefer to work silently, and so there's this balance of working on substance versus working on the narrative, and both substance and the narrative are equally important. But in many cases, in the building of companies at the early stage, it's really important for a company to have a strong narrative, right? No point if you've got lots and lots of substance, but it's only available to a few people. So I'd say, I think that's one key and probably a very common example that you've heard. So, apologies that you're hearing this probably for the 100th time. But I think the key thing is having that awareness, like having that self-awareness of culture is super important. For all the work that I've done on myself, after all of that, I've come to realize that, well, if I behave a certain way, if I have a certain strength or weakness, it's not because I'm Asian, right? It's just me. It's nothing to do with my cultural heritage. But at the same time, understanding the context or being mindful about the context in which I was brought up helps me to uncover some of the inner conversations that I have, right? So for example, I think I talked about this a while ago, right? As part of my personal reflection, as part of my personal journey, I got to one point where I realized, hey, why am I not willing to make investments into the future when I know that it can help me, right? Or why has my tendency been to bootstrap and to pick solutions that are sometimes subpar just because they're cheaper, and resulting in, greater complexity, resulting in higher cost in the long term, right? So for instance, instead of hiring a grade A kind of accountant, hire a grade B accountant because it's cheaper, and then later realizing that, the junior accountant caused a whole bunch of problems that I will have to undo later on. So, after making a whole bunch of these mistakes and then realizing, it's because of the context of my childhood, and the inner conversations that I have, that causes me to lean towards this kind of decision. So when I uncover this kind of thinking, this kind of inner conversations, just helps me to make better decisions.
Thank you for watching.